So back in early 2024, the US government released this absolute mountain of documents all connected to Jeffrey Epstein. But, after all the dust settled on millions and millions of pages, what did we actually learn? In this explainer, we're going to try to cut through all that noise and find the signal.
And really, this is the question that's been hanging over this whole thing. When you just drop millions of pages on the public, are you actually providing answers, or are you just creating more confusion? Let's dive in and find out.
Okay, to really wrap your head around the challenge here, you have to start with the scale. We're talking about nearly 3.5 million pages. That's not a file, that's an entire library. This sheer volume basically transformed what should have been a criminal case into this sprawling, almost impossible to understand archive.
All right, so why now? Why were these files all released at this moment? Well, it all came down to a law called the Epstein Files Transparency Act. And on paper, the goal seemed pretty simple. Finally give the American public the transparency they've been demanding for years.
The Department of Justice, they really framed this as the final chapter. They talked about this carefully managed process for public disclosure. But as we're about to see, the reality of that disclosure turned out to be a very, very different story.
Yeah, the reality was a huge contrast to the promise. What the public actually got wasn't some clear stream of information, it was a data tsunami. And that massive volume, that flood of just raw data, ended up creating a whole new and very serious set of problems. I mean, the files had this staggering variety of stuff in them. Internal government emails, raw investigative notes, literally thousands of videos and images. And buried deep inside all of it was one particularly explosive document we're going to come back to, a drafted 2007 indictment that was never, ever filed.
This whole approach led to a really sharp criticism, and it's known as obfuscation by scale. The argument is pretty simple. Just dumping millions of unorganized pages isn't real transparency. Sure, it might satisfy the letter of the law, but in practice, it can actually bury the truth even deeper.
Of course, this is what everyone was waiting for, right? The names? Beyond any single piece of evidence, these files promised a glimpse into Epstein's network. And what they painted was a disturbing picture, not just of crime, but of incredible access and influence that reached all the way to the highest levels of power.
Now, before we look at any of the names, the DOJ issued this really critical warning. Just because someone is mentioned in these files, that does not mean they are guilty. A lot of people appeared just incidentally, maybe in news articles, on contact lists, or in allegations that were never verified.
In the world of tech, one name really stood out: Elon Musk. Emails from back in 2012 showed Epstein trying to arrange a visit for Musk, who apparently asked in one exchange which night would be the wildest party on Epstein's island.
Musk, for his part, fiercely denied ever going to the island or having anything to do with Epstein's crimes. He put out this public statement, basically arguing he had no need for a creepy loser like Epstein, and he called for anyone involved to be prosecuted.
Former President Donald Trump's name came up a lot. We're talking tens of thousands of times across these documents. But the DOJ was really quick to point out that the vast majority of these were just incidental mentions in news clippings, on contact lists, or as part of allegations that the FBI had already decided weren't credible.
The documents also brought up even more questions about former President Bill Clinton. They revealed that during a deposition in 2016, Epstein pleaded the fifth over and over, more than a dozen times, when he was asked about Clinton, including questions about whether the former president had ever been to his private island.
But maybe the most catastrophic failure of this entire document release had nothing to do with powerful men. It had everything to do with the very people the justice system is supposed to protect, the survivors.
This was the verdict that came directly from survivors and their advocates. What was supposed to be an exercise in accountability became this profound breach of trust, as just catastrophic failures in redacting information exposed the very people the system was meant to protect. So here's how it all went so wrong. Despite all these promises of a careful review, documents were published that contained victims' names, their contact info, and even their financial details. The DOJ had to scramble to pull thousands of files offline, but the damage was already done. And in the aftermath, at least 31 survivors reported being harassed.
Okay, so this brings us to the final and most crucial question. After all of this, the data dump, the headlines, the re-traumatized victims, is any of it going to lead to actual accountability?
Well, the answer from the Department of Justice was a pretty blunt no.
Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche stated publicly that after they reviewed all the files, they found nothing that would let them prosecute anybody new. The review, he basically declared, is over.
And this just created this fundamental disagreement. The DOJ's position was, hey, we followed the law, we complied with the statute. But critics fired right back, saying that just following the letter of the law isn't the same thing as providing real justice or actual transparency.
And maybe nothing highlights all this frustration more than this one document. Buried deep in those millions of pages was a drafted 2007 federal indictment against Epstein and 3 of his co-conspirators. It suggests that years before he got that lenient deal, authorities knew the case was much, much bigger. And it just leaves you with this haunting question: how much suffering could have been prevented if they had just acted on it back then?
So ultimately, the release gave us a record of institutional failure, of missed opportunities, and of some really disturbing connections. But with no new charges coming, it leaves us with this final, unresolved tension. The files are now open for the whole world to see, but for the victims and for the public that's still seeking justice, the case feels anything but closed.